My fiancée folded her engagement ring into my hand and said, "My family thinks I'm making a mistake." I didn't try to change her mind. I simply wished her happiness. 2 nights later, a car pulled into my driveway. The person who stepped out wasn't her. And the first question they asked changed everything. If you want real, honest stories every single week, make sure you're subscribed to Vows Stories. Join us right now before we continue. I'm 35 years old, I work as an electrician for a commercial contracting company outside of Denver, and I want to start by saying that I'm not the kind of guy who talks about his feelings much. My father was a quiet man. My grandfather was quieter, and somewhere along the line I inherited the family habit of keeping most of what I feel locked somewhere behind my ribs. So the fact that I'm telling you this story at all should tell you something about how much it changed me. Her name doesn't matter for the sake of this story, so I'll just call her my fiancée, the way I'd been calling her for the 8 months since I proposed to her on a Tuesday, of all days, in the parking lot of the hardware store where we'd had our first real conversation 4 years earlier. Not the most romantic setting, I know, but she'd laughed so hard when I got down on one knee next to a stack of mulch bags that a stranger stopped his cart just to ask if everything was okay. We'd been together for 4 years total by the time all of this happened, and for most of that time, things were good. Not perfect, nobody's relationship is perfect, but good in the way that matters, the kind of good where you actually miss the sound of someone's voice on the days you don't see them. She worked as a dental hygienist at a practice about 15 minutes from my apartment, and I used to stop by on my lunch breaks just to see her for 10 minutes before heading back to whatever job site I was wiring that week. Small things like that. The kind of small things that add up to a life. Her family was a different story, though, and I think that's important to say up front, because it's the piece that everything else in this story hangs on. Her parents came from money, real money, the kind of money that builds a house with a circular driveway and a name for the house itself, like it's a person. Her father owned 2 auto dealerships in the Denver metro area, and her mother sat on the board of some charity foundation that threw galas twice a year at hotels I couldn't have afforded to valet park at. I met them for the first time about 6 months into dating their daughter, at a dinner where her father asked me, without much preamble, what my 5-year financial plan looked like. I told him I was an electrician with steady union work and a decent 401k, and he nodded in that particular way people nod when they've already made up their mind about you and are just being polite about it. Over the 4 years, it never really got better, not cruel, exactly. Never outright rude to my face. Just this constant low hum of disapproval that I got used to the way you get used to a refrigerator humming in the next room. Little comments at holidays about how her college roommate had married a surgeon. Questions about whether I planned to move up from working with my hands someday, phrased just delicately enough that I couldn't call it what it was. I stopped expecting warmth from them a long time before the engagement, and honestly, I'd made a kind of peace with that. I wasn't marrying her family. I was marrying her. So when she showed up at my apartment on a Wednesday evening in April, about 8 months after the proposal, with a look on her face I hadn't seen since her grandmother's funeral, I knew before she said a single word that something had shifted. She stood in my kitchen doorway, still wearing her scrubs from work, her hair pulled back in the same low ponytail she always wore on shift, and she didn't say hello. She just reached up, slid the ring off her finger, the modest half-carat solitaire I'd saved for over a year and a half to afford, and folded it into my palm with both of her hands, the way you'd hand someone something fragile you were afraid of dropping. "My family thinks I'm making a mistake," she said. I remember the kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and, somewhere outside, a neighbor's sprinkler system kicking on for its evening cycle. I looked down at the ring sitting in my open palm, still warm from her finger, and then back up at her face, and I felt something in my chest go very heavy and very still. I want to tell you that I fought for it right there. That I asked 100 questions, that I demanded to know what had been said, who had said it, whether her father had finally succeeded in talking her out of 4 years of her own life. But that's not who I am, and it's not what I did. I've watched enough people in my life get talked into staying somewhere they didn't want to be, watched my own mother spend 6 years in a marriage she should have left after year 2 because someone convinced her that leaving would be the bigger mistake. I wasn't going to be the person standing between someone I loved and whatever she genuinely believed she needed. "Okay," I said, closing my hand gently around the ring. "If that's what you think is right, then I want you to be happy. I mean that." She blinked at me like she'd expected something else, some kind of resistance she'd have to push through, and for a second, something flickered across her face that I couldn't quite read. Then she nodded, said something quiet about needing time to think, and left. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after the door closed, just holding the ring, listening to the sprinklers outside cycling through their pattern, section by section, the way they'd done every evening that whole spring. The next 2 days were about as bad as any I can remember. I went to work both mornings because the job doesn't stop for a person's personal life. Wired 3 panels on a new build out in Aurora, ate lunch alone in my truck instead of driving over to see her the way I usually did, and came home each evening to an apartment that felt about twice as large and twice as empty as it had a week before. I didn't call her. I didn't text her. Not out of some strategy, but because I genuinely didn't know what I'd say that wouldn't sound like I was trying to talk her out of her own decision, and I'd meant what I told her in that kitchen. If she needed to walk away, I wasn't going to make that harder for her. Friday evening, 2 nights after she'd handed me the ring, I was sitting on my back steps with a beer I hadn't really touched, watching the sky do that long orange thing it does over the foothills in early spring, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. My apartment complex has assigned parking, and I knew every car that belonged in that space, hers included, and this wasn't her car. It was a dark blue sedan I didn't recognize, and for a second my stomach dropped, thinking maybe something had happened to her, an accident, something worse. This is where things take a turn. What would you have assumed at this point? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The driver's door opened, and the person who stepped out wasn't her. It was her mother. I want you to understand something about her mother, because it matters for what happened next. In 4 years, her mother had been to my apartment exactly 0 times. Every gathering, every dinner, every holiday had happened on her family's turf, at their house with the circular driveway, or at some restaurant they'd chosen because it was convenient, which usually meant convenient to their side of town. Her mother showing up unannounced at my apartment, alone, without her husband, without their daughter, was so far outside anything I'd ever seen from that family that I actually stood up off the steps without meaning to, beer still in my hand, half braced for whatever was coming. She walked up the little concrete path to my door, wearing a cardigan I remembered from a Thanksgiving 2 years back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest like she was cold, even though it wasn't a cold evening. And before I could say a word, before I could even get out a greeting, she asked me a question that I did not see coming from any direction. "Did she tell you why she gave the ring back?" her mother asked. "She said your family thinks she's making a mistake," I said carefully, setting the beer down on the step behind me. Her mother let out a breath that seemed to have been held in her chest for longer than just that walk up my driveway. "That's not what happened," she said. "That's not what any of us said. I need you to understand that before this goes any further, because I think my daughter has gotten something very badly twisted, and I don't know how to fix it without both of you hearing the truth at the same time." I stood there in my own doorway, genuinely stunned, and asked her to just tell me what actually happened. She told me that 2 weeks earlier, at a family dinner I hadn't been invited to, one of some kind of ongoing series they did without me, her father had brought up his health. He'd been having chest pains for a couple of months that he'd been keeping quiet about, avoiding the doctor the way stubborn men of a certain generation do, and it had finally scared him enough to get checked out. The cardiologist had found a blockage that needed a procedure, not an emergency, not life-threatening if handled soon, but serious enough that it had rattled the whole family. And in the middle of that conversation, worried and scared in a way none of them had seen him before, her father had said something about wanting to see his daughter settled and taken care of before anything happened to him. Something about wishing he'd spent less time worrying about resumes and more time just being grateful she'd found someone steady. "He said he'd been an idiot about you," her mother told me, standing there on my front step with her arms still crossed. Those were his words. That he'd spent 4 years measuring you against some idea in his head instead of seeing what was actually in front of him, which was a man who shows up, who's steady, who clearly loves his daughter. He said the biggest mistake in this whole thing wasn't her choice. It was his attitude about it. I felt something in my chest that I genuinely didn't have a name for in that moment. "Then why?" I started to ask. "Why would she think?" "Because she wasn't in the room for that part," her mother said. "She came in near the end, after her father had already said something else, something clumsy, about how scary it is to hand your daughter off to someone and just have to trust it'll work out, how a father never really feels ready for that no matter who the man is. She only caught the tail end. the part where he sounded doubtful, and she left the dinner upset before he could explain what he actually meant. And then apparently she spent 2 weeks telling herself a story that isn't true and gave you back that ring and hasn't answered when I call her, and I am standing on your porch at 7 o'clock on a Friday because I could not let this go one more day without at least trying to fix it. I stood there holding on to the doorframe, trying to process the fact that the woman who had, for 4 years, made me feel like an outsider at every family dinner, was now standing in my driveway trying to undo a misunderstanding that her own husband's clumsy, scared, middle-of-a-health crisis sentence had caused. "Does she know you're here?" I asked. "No," she said. "And I probably shouldn't be here without talking to her first. I know that. But I've watched my daughter cry in her car in our driveway for the past 2 nights, thinking she made the right decision to protect herself from a family that doesn't approve of you, when the truth is almost the exact opposite of that, and I couldn't sit at home and let that keep going one more night." I asked her if I could call her daughter right then, with her standing there, and she said yes. My fiancée picked up on the second ring, her voice tight and careful the way it had been since Wednesday. "Hey," she said. "Your mom is standing in my driveway," I said. There was a long pause on the other end. "What?" "She came to tell me what actually happened at that dinner," I said. "The one with your dad. She says you only heard the end of what he said and that you got it backwards." Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear something shift in her breathing. "Backwards how?" I handed the phone to her mother, and I stood there on my own front step, in my own driveway, listening to one side of a conversation between a mother and daughter that I probably had no business witnessing, but that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I heard her mother say gently the same things she'd just told me, about the chest pains, about the cardiologist, about her father sitting at that table scared in a way none of them had ever seen, and saying out loud, in front of the whole family, that he'd been wrong about me, that he was ashamed of how he'd treated the past 4 years. That the only mistake in the whole situation had been his own attitude. I heard my fiancée start crying on the other end of that call, not the tight, controlled crying I imagined she'd been doing alone in her car those past 2 nights, but something looser, something like relief breaking loose all at once. She showed up at my apartment 40 minutes later, her mother having left just after handing the phone back to me and giving me a long look that I still can't fully describe, something between apology and gratitude. My fiancée walked up that same little concrete path, and instead of a ring folded into someone's palm, this time it was her stepping straight into my arms without a word, holding on so tight I felt it in my own ribs. "I'm sorry," she said into my shoulder. "I heard the worst version of it, and I just ran with it, because some part of me has been braced for years for them to finally say it out loud, and when I heard the tail end of that sentence, it just confirmed something I'd already been afraid of." "You don't have to apologize for being scared," I said. "I've spent 4 years watching your family look at me like I was a placeholder until someone better came along. I get why one bad sentence would feel like proof." We sat on those back steps for a long time that night, the same steps I'd been sitting on with an untouched beer when her mother's car first pulled in. And we talked in a way we hadn't talked in months, about her father, about money, about the quiet resentment I'd been carrying without fully admitting it to myself, about how much easier it is to build a wall than to knock one down once it's already up. That was 6 months ago now. A few things have changed since that Friday evening. Her father had his procedure about 3 weeks after all of this, a stent placed in an artery that the cardiologist said had been more serious than any of them initially let on, and he came through it fine, home within 2 days, grumbling the whole time about hospital food the way stubborn men of a certain generation always do. I visited him twice during his recovery, and the second time, sitting in his living room while he was propped up on the couch under a blanket his wife kept fussing with, he told me directly, without me asking, that he owed me a real conversation he should have had years earlier. He said measuring a man by his job title instead of his character was his father's mistake before it was his, and that scaring himself half to death in a cardiologist's office had a way of making a person see clearly what actually mattered. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was a little clumsy, a little too focused on his own regret rather than my feelings, but it was honest, and I've come to believe that honest and clumsy beats smooth and empty most days of the week. My fiancé and I got married 4 months ago in a small ceremony at a venue about 40 minutes outside Denver, string lights strung between the trees along the reception area, her father walking her down the aisle looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. Her mother cried through most of the ceremony, and afterward found me near the drink table and told me quietly that she was sorry it had taken a health scare and a driveway confession to say what she should have said the day I first sat down at their dinner table. I told her it was all right, and mostly, at this point, I mean it. We still get the occasional comment about money or career paths at family dinners. Old habits don't disappear overnight, but there's a different tone underneath it now, less measuring, more teasing, the kind of ribbing that comes from people who've actually decided you belong at the table. My wife wears the same ring now that she folded into my hand that Wednesday evening, the one I'd saved a year and a half to afford. And some nights I catch her looking at it in a way that tells me she's still thinking about how close we came to losing something over a sentence she only half heard. I keep thinking about that evening on the back steps, the sprinklers, the sky doing that long orange thing over the foothills, the sound of a car in my driveway that wasn't hers. It taught me something I don't think I'd have learned any other way, which is that the stories we tell ourselves in the silence when we only catch the tail end of someone else's fear can do more damage than almost anything spoken out loud on purpose. If her mother hadn't gotten in that car on a Friday evening and driven across town to stand on the porch of a man her family had spent years quietly doubting, I don't know where any of us would be right now. Probably not standing in a backyard full of string lights, watching her father walk her down an aisle he almost never got to see. Did this ending turn out the way you expected? Comment below and tell me what scenario we should cover in the next video.